Hello and welcome to the Pharma Forum podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock. After years of headlines and hand-wringing about the Inflation Reduction Act, we finally have the first 10 negotiated prices, and we're going to start to see the key part of this act, the Medicare price negotiation, come into effect. So what happens next, and how is that operation going to shake out? Well, to talk about that and maybe get some answers, I'm joined by Alice Valder Curran, a partner at Hogan Lovells, a longtime government operator and healthcare policy expert. Welcome to the show, Alice.
Thanks, Jonah. I'm glad to be here.
I'll let you tell the audience a little bit about your background and what kind of qualifies you to speak on this, and then we'll get into the wonky stuff.
Thanks, Jonah. So I'm a partner at Hogan Lovells in our healthcare practice, and I've spent the last 25 years or so working with pharmaceutical manufacturers of all sizes, deal with government pricing obligations that they have. I started my practice out in the late 90s when what we really were dealing with was the relatively new Medicaid drug rebate program and 340B drug pricing program. Then we had the codification of the average sales price reporting requirement for Part B drugs. We had the Part D benefit that was implemented in 2006. We had the Affordable Care Act and some pretty significant changes to those drug pricing programs in 2010. And last but certainly not least, we have the IRA in 2022. And as you noted at the top, our first round of quote unquote negotiated prices. So I work with drug companies helping them understand these obligations and really work with them on pricing, commercialization, and market access strategies. And that includes how do we plan for and implement the IRA?
First of all, these numbers, how much of a surprise were they from an industry standpoint? Were they more or less what we expected? Were they higher? Were they lower? Is the impact going to be as bad as feared?
According to the trade press, which is sort of what I go by, it didn't seem like there were huge outliers in where the numbers landed. I think maybe part of that's because a number of the companies had telegraphed ahead of time that they were going to be able to deal with the numbers, at least as to the impacted products and in the normal course. And when we talk about impact, it's important to talk about these 10 drugs. Or it's actually more than 10 because some of these drugs have multiple drugs that are rolled up into one. And then think about what it means for all the other products and the pipelines for these products. For these 10 or 10 plus products, the trade press seemed to think it wasn't a huge surprise that the numbers weren't that far off what was expected. I think the companies largely have telegraphed that they'll be able to deal with these discounts going forward. What we don't know, and I think we might talk a little bit about this later, is what it's going to mean for all the generics and biosimilars that are going to launch against these products in the coming years. We have to watch and wait that. But the bigger impact and where I don't think we can be as sanguine about the impact is what it's doing to pipelines, because what's very, very clear is that the IRA still is absolutely impacting investment decisions. We've all read about individual companies saying we're going to not pursue this indication because we're not going to do a small indication before a large indication because it's a small molecule and we only have 9 years before it's going to be impacted by the IRA. We're definitely seeing that. And just last week, I was speaking with the head transactions lawyer at a big pharma who said 100% whenever they're looking at an investment decision, one of the filters they apply is the IRA. And that filter impacts everything about that transaction in terms of the clinical development plan, in terms of how the deal is structured, when the milestone payments are going to be. We can look at what's happened with these 10 drugs and say, what does that mean for those 10 drugs? But there's no sign that I can tell that there's any let up on what it's doing for the earlier stage products and the investment decisions that are being made.
Right. And we can't necessarily infer that the negotiations for the first 10 drugs are in the same ballpark as the negotiations for the next 10 drugs, right?
I think that's right. One of the things to keep in mind is there was only one oncolytic in the first 10, and that was Imbruvica. That also happened to be the drug that had the smallest, quote unquote, discount off of list price, roughly 38%, as I recall. It was in the 30s, whereas some of the other products were in the 70s. My understanding is that some could say that's a huge win because it was a smaller discount, but it's relative to what the discount was beforehand, the relative to the discounts that you typically see on oncology products, particularly oncology products that treat narrow indications, orphan indications. And the next round, we're going to see a lot more oncolytics in the next round of drugs. And so I do think that that it's all relative and it's going to variable on the disease state that we see in the cohort of products that are subject to negotiation.
So to get a little bit at this question of like, is it negotiation? Is it price setting? The rhetoric was always from pharma that, this sort of negotiation is sort of like negotiation with a gun to your head because the government holds all the cards. So in light of that, and I'm not arguing with that. I think you just have to read the bill. um, why aren't they lower? I mean, what does keep the government from, really putting the screws to pharma on this? Obviously, you can't read their minds, but how do you think how do you think the negotiations actually played out in that regard, and how do you think we ended up where we are?
Well, whether it's a real negotiation or not, I think everyone ended up quote unquote agreeing to a price. Interestingly, five of the nine manufacturers, there are 10 products, 10 plus products, but only nine manufacturers because J&J had two. Five of the nine didn't sign until the last offer. Four of them appeared to have signed before then, but I think it's worth noting that five waited until the end. That doesn't mean that the other four couldn't have, but five of them didn't sign until the end. We don't know which ones those are, and they clearly, when your participation in the Medicare program overall and the Medicaid program overall, there is very little ability to walk away from that. In terms of why they're not lower, I mean, some of these discounts are north of a 70% reduction in list price. So I guess my question back to you is how low is low enough? And it's all relative. And the only sort of substantive thing I can say about that, because we don't yet know how CMS landed on these prices. They don't have to explain the prices and why they landed where they did until March 1st. But their guidelines for negotiating these prices requires them to look at therapeutic alternatives, requires them to look at cost effectiveness analyses that are not quality based. Each and every one of these top 10 drugs is incredibly valuable and effective. That's why they're in the top 10, right? Because everyone uses them for the disease states for which they are indicated. They deliver value. That's why the PBMs are covering them, even under their own models. That's why you're seeing the utilization that you're seeing. And so all of these products had really strong value stories going in because they're clearly effective at what they do, in many cases across a whole range of indications. So I think you look at leverage, you look at probably some pretty compelling value stories. And so I think those are probably some of the reasons. I would imagine that's part of what the discussion was with CMS.
That's really interesting, and I mean the reason I say why aren't they lower, I guess to spin that out a little more, because yeah, they are quite large discounts. On the other hand, you have two things. One, as you say, the pharma companies are communicating that they can roll with this to some extent, they can manage, so that suggests they're not criminally low. But then also there's the question about other countries, right? Part of the point of this was to bring our drug prices in line with what other countries pay for the same drugs. And even with these discounts, that's largely not been achieved. Only I think one of them is actually lower than another country pays. So talk to me about that piece of it too, I guess. Why can't we kind of, if that's the benchmark of a fair price, or is that the benchmark of a fair price?
That is exactly the problem. That is not the benchmark for a fair price. Anyone who's done any study of these international reference prices and the health technology assessments that are used in setting them knows that it is a completely false dichotomy. These other countries get these products much later than they become available in the United States on a much more limited basis to the patient population. And so using those prices as a benchmark for the United States is a apples to oranges comparison. And the way that they do the health technology assessments, what they include and what they consider and not consider, and clearly on the side that that's not the right way to do things because it's just a completely different system. And so it's really hard to make that comparison if you're not going to control for all the material differences between them.
To the extent that it's true that we subsidize drugs for the rest of the world, that that problem can only be solved by both raising their prices and lowering ours. If we just lowered ours to match theirs, then there just wouldn't be enough money to make the drugs, right?
But I also think it's not just about price, it's also about access, right? It can't be just about price, it has to be about access and use. And so it's just we could probably have several podcasts talking about how to right size comparisons for international reference prices. And it's a data point, but I don't think it's a particularly persuasive data point if you actually dig in to understand how the different systems really work.
Well, thank you for engaging me a little bit on sort of some analysis of the pricing themselves. I know that wasn't the main thing we were talking about today. The main thing we're talking about is what happens next and how does this get operationalized. I know there's some concerns around there. There's some questions. So let's start getting into it. First of all, when do the consumers start seeing a benefit from this, and will the consumers actually see the same level of benefit as the discount of this price, which is not a price to the consumer?
The consumers, the patients will absolutely see the benefit of that, and they'll see it with dispenses as of January 1st, 2026, which is a scant, 20 something, 22 months away. No, 17 months away. I'm doing my math wrong, or so, depending on when the podcast airs. So, by law, the manufacturers of these 10 plus drugs are required to ensure that patients have access to the MFP at the point of dispensing, and that the dispensing pharmacies are made whole for that discount. The challenge with that has to be solved over the next 17 months, is that that is not how the supply chain in the United States works. Manufacturers sell drugs and pharmacies buy drugs for all of their patients. They don't have a segregated inventory for their Medicare patients who are entitled to access the MFP price, and everyone else. They buy everything. And after the fact, after the point of dispensing, they say, oh, these number of units that we dispensed today were eligible for the MFP. And so, in order to effectuate this, the first decision CMS had to make was, are we going to require manufacturers to sell into the channel at the discounted price, which everyone was concerned about, because how do you control for diversion if you're selling in at this deeply discounted price relative to the status quo, and make sure that only the people who are entitled to that discount actually get it. And so I think CMS recognized pretty quickly that they had to employ a rebate model where manufacturers don't sell into the channel at the discounted price, but instead they sell in through the normal course, and after the fact, the dispensing pharmacies seek a rebate. The dispensing pharmacies front the discounted price to the patients, and then they get made whole by the manufacturers after the fact on eligible claims. So CMS issued guidance in May, sort of putting the meat on the bones of what this rebate process might look like. But that sounds relatively simple. Fine, pharmacies will just seek rebates. Well, every single pharmacy in the United States has to sign up for a process that enables these rebates. And it's not just the big chains who can do so in a centralized way, it's the regional pharmacies, it's the mom and pop pharmacies. So, how do you get them all enrolled? How do you make sure that they're all using the same data files to submit the data? How do you make sure that the manufacturers have the ability to validate those claims in a meaningful way, and then get the money back to those pharmacies in a timely way, because they're floating the discount in the interim? What do you do if there are disputes? And then there's this other really important provision in the law that says manufacturers don't have to offer both a 340B discount on a unit as well as an MFP discount on a unit. And the 340B drug discount program, as your listeners probably know, is this program that requires manufacturers to give significant discounts, sort of MFP worthy discount type level. So really sub-commercial price discounts to certain safety net providers. And a lot of these safety net providers are going to be dispensing MFP drugs to their own patients. And so if a manufacturer gets a claim for a unit, they have to say, well, did I already give the 340B discount on this MFP unit? If not, sure, I'll give the MFP rebate. But if I have, I'm not going to give an MFP discount on that on top of it. And then you also have to look at where the prices are relative to each other. So there's a lot of complexity, a lot of need for data interchange, and none of that is built. So we literally are building the plane while we fly it. And this has to be up and running in 17 months. CMS is requiring manufacturers to submit a plan that describes how they're going to do all this. Manufacturers, tell us how you're going to do it.
We're just talking about the potential for accidental error, not even to introduce the potential for intentional fraud here, right? When you've got rebates and you can apply for, you can apply for the 340B rebate, you can apply, like, it seems potentially like very thorny.
Very thorny. I mean, you're right. This is thorny enough without worrying about misconduct. And I think everyone is approaching this in good faith. Manufacturers recognize the statutory obligation they have. And by the way, manufacturers are subject to significant civil monetary penalties if they're not complying. So manufacturers have to do this, and they want to do it in the right way, but they need to have a system that works for everyone. We're waiting for final guidance from CMS on how to effectuate it. Then manufacturers will have to submit their plan. CMS will have to approve that plan. The plans will be made public in part, at least what's not confidential will be made public. So there's just a lot to do that isn't sexy. For people who, like me, who work in the supply chain with pharmaceutical manufacturers, we understand the nuts and bolts of what has to happen. But there is a lot of room for mischief. There's a lot of room for complexity. I'm just really hoping that this isn't healthcare.gov all over again in terms of a really, really, really awful IT system rollout, but it has that potential if folks really aren't able to work together and find a seamless end-to-end solution.
Right. And it's not as if the government has proven itself capable of doing this in the past. I mean, a lot of the problems you just described are similar to the problems that have been plaguing the 340B program, the 340B leakage, right?
Absolutely. So, and another challenge with the 340B program is that they don't do rebate models until at least J&J, as they recently announced, is going to try to implement a rebate model. The 340B model is to get the discounts at the time of purchase. That's how the covered entities have always wanted their discount, but they don't track it on a one-to-one unit basis. And that's one of the real challenges manufacturers are facing is they say, hey, by statute, we are promised that we just have to make available the lower of the MFP or the 340B price. For that, we need to know at the time the rebate's being claimed by the pharmacy, is this a 340B unit or not? We have to know that at the time we adjudicate the rebate, because that's the only way that we actually get the benefit of one of the few statutory protections the IRA provides for manufacturers. And that is squarely a challenge for CMS to work through with the Health Resources and Services Administration, which runs the 340B program. And I think that's why some commentators have said they're not surprised that the J&J rebate model, which was announced a bit ago, is proposed to be rolled out for the two drugs that J&J has that are subject to MFPs, Xarelto and Stelara, because they're going to have to worry and implement this problem or implement a solution for this non-duplication provision in 17 months. And the rebate model on the 340B side will make that much easier to do.
Earlier, you mentioned the impact of this on generics and the market more broadly. Can you talk a little more about that?
For those of us who work with branded companies, and I primarily do, the branded side of the industry, there's not a lot of sympathy for the generics industry, but the generics industry does play a really important public health role in the United States. If you actually look at the percentage of drugs that are dispensed that are generic versus branded, it's like, north of 80% of all utilization in the US is generic, and it's lower cost. And that's really important to our public health system. The generic companies operate on a pretty slim margin in general. And where they make the margin to support their business model is when they are first to file or early in the competition with the branded drugs that they compete with. And the reason generics have a larger margin in those early stages of generic entry is because they're competing against a brand drug that has a high WAC relative to the generic. And so in those early days, the generics are able to discount, let's say 10% or so to the branded price until more generics enter the market. And then their margin gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller over time. But they do have some period of time where they're able to have that competition or they're able to enjoy a larger margin, even more true for biosimilars. With the IRA, we now have the likelihood of generics and biosimilars coming onto the market and competing not with a WAC price, but with an MFP. And so all of a sudden, this enormous margin that they've been enjoying that is important not just to the success of that individual generic or biosimilar, but to their overall business model faces the real likelihood of being much, much smaller. I think every single one of the products that has been subject to an MFP has a generic or biosimilar coming to market, if not in 2025, then in the years after that. So those that come in 2025, they'll still be competing against a regular WAC, but the MFP will be out there. We're all waiting to see what the PBMs do in their negotiations with the drug companies with those MFPs, even if they're not in effect yet. And so that still has the potential to impact generic launches, even if the MFP isn't in effect yet. But for anything that is launched after 2026, it's going to change the model. And we don't quite know yet, but I'm worried about what it's going to do to the generics industry and whether we already have a supply challenge on some of the more complex generics because of the cost needed or the cost basis for for manufacturing some of these products. I think we really have to keep an eye on whether we're going to see a thinning of the generics ranks as the IRA takes its toll on the generic business model as well.
Which potentially leads to shortages, especially we're talking about the most popular and therefore most needed drugs for this population.
I hope I'm Chicken Little. I would be surprised if there isn't some impact on those business models.
Well, if nothing else, it seems like that in determining where, I mean, maybe not at this point since the ship's already sailed, but in determining which drugs to compete with, in order to get those margins, the generics might shy away from ones that are likely to be eligible for this negotiation. And then,
My concern is that by the time, I guess the way I'd say it is, I'm not sure that there are those products. Every year, there are an additional 15, 20, 25 drugs that are added to the negotiation pool, and it's additive. They don't replace them. And you just have to have $200 million in Medicare sales in order to be eligible for negotiation. And so I think it's the not too distant future. We are going to see a world in which products are subject to negotiations right at the 9 or 13 year mark because and right at the $200 million threshold. So not even the $1 billion products because those have all been negotiated. They're gonna CMS is gonna work its way down the list, and products are either going to face instant generic competition, or they're going to face MFPs, and there's not going to be much of a time period where you're going to escape that past the 9 or 13 year mark.
so we're getting towards the end of our time, which really shocks me because it feels like it flew by. Let's talk a little bit about oncolytics. You mentioned there's only one oncolytic on the list now, but there's likely to be more next time around. What makes oncolytics different? Why is this negotiation maybe more concerning around them?
Sure. So the very sort of typical clinical development profile for oncology products is that you get them approved for a narrow indication to get them on the market. When they're first approved, they're often approved for like third line use or something along those lines. And then once the product is on the market, the manufacturer develops additional indications that are broader. The label gets updated from third line to second line to first line, and all of that takes time. But the IRA negotiation clock starts with the launch of that first indication. And so what that means is that manufacturers are going to look at the model of launching with a narrow indication to get the product on the market and say, I can't afford to do that anymore because I need to maximize the revenue I have. And that means I'm not going to just push a drug to market just to get it on the market, even if it's a narrow indication, particularly if it's small molecule, because I can't afford to have 2 years at a small indication approval. I'm going to wait and go to market first with the larger indication or the largest indication I can, maybe do the small indication at the same time, maybe put that later. And what that ultimately means is just the delay of getting these products to patients because it takes longer to get a larger indication study filled, tested, proved out, and that means it's just going to take longer for these products to make it to patients. And so, when I mentioned before that investors who are looking at investing in biotechs and they're looking at products to invest in and how it's impacting their clinical development plan, this is one of the way it's impacting it is they're saying, no, we're not going to start with this small indication. We're going to start with a large indication, which means it's going to take longer for us to get to market. It's going to stretch out the milestone payments. And for patients, it means it's just going to take longer to have access to this product. And oncology is one of those disease states where people don't have that time. And that's why it's so heartbreaking, particularly for the smaller molecule oncolytics, and why it's such a priority to get the 9 to 13 year differential fixed once we have Congress back doing real work.
It sounds like there's a real just general issue here that the IRA has sort of short-term benefits, but maybe long-term detriments, which is great, I suppose, if you're a Democrat facing an election in 2 months, when all of these problems are going to be next year and the year after that's problem. So to me, that's like the real challenge for pharma is kind of communicating that they're not just worried about their bottom line. There's real concern of sort of macroeconomic domino effects from this that haven't been fully considered. I mean, would you say that's accurate? And where does the industry go from here to try to kind of get that word out and get back in with Congress and get some of these things tweaked?
Well, I do think that there is some recognition in Congress, whether they say it publicly or not, that 9 to 13 needs to be fixed, that the orphan exception exclusion from eligibility for negotiation needs to be changed to not just be limited to products with a single orphan designation for a single disease state. So I do think that there are some recognitions that some things need to be fixed, that just doesn't make sense. We just have to see if they're able to get it over the finish line. But what I tend to remind people about when they say, oh, Alice, you are being chicken little about this, I want to remind folks what it felt like while they were waiting to get their first COVID vaccine, because I remember what it was like. The people in the United States had the first access to a COVID vaccine, and we had access to more than one COVID vaccine. We had an abundance of choice because we are the leading pharmaceutical and biotechnology economy in the world. And those companies are here developing products for that reason. And so we had first access to them in the United States. And we saw other countries that waited and people died. And people died is such an understatement, but you understand my point. We had access here that no one else had, and it's because of the industry we have. And that is one of those long-term costs or assets that we need to protect. I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot of the Fairfax County, I live in Northern Virginia, Fairfax County Government Center, waiting to finally be told I could go in and get my first vaccination. And the relief I felt that I was finally going to have some sort of protection against this horrible virus. And I had that, even that benefit was such a gift. And I had it because we live in the United States. And it's easy to think COVID's in the mirror, but we have a very precious ecosystem here. There needs to be some balance for sure. I'm not going to say that there doesn't need to be balance, but we really have to be careful before we mess with a system that delivers more life-saving therapies for more people around the world than any place else. And these long-term impacts are easy to ignore as long-term impacts, but some of them we really need to make sure we fix soon.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Alice. It's been a really fascinating conversation. It's added a lot of depth to my understanding of the IRA, and hopefully it has for our listeners as well. Any final thoughts?
No, I've just watched this space. I think the next thing that we are going to see that's of interest is CMS is going to issue the next round of drugs for negotiation. It's going to be 15 this time, not 10. Could be 15 plus if they sort of lump a bunch of drugs together like they did in a few cases in this first round. They have to publish that list by February 1st. It could be earlier than that, but it will be by February 1st. And by March 1st is when CMS has to issue their explanations of the MFPs that they negotiated that we discussed at the top of the podcast. And that is something that everyone is really looking forward to seeing so that we can understand these numbers, which right now are just numbers. As we discussed, it's hard to put context around them. But by March 1st, we will have that context that will really allow everyone to better understand why CMS landed where they did, and hopefully provide some lessons learned that otherwise sort of are a mystery to us now when we have the numbers and only the numbers.
Right. And give us a little bit of predictive power. So it's not like a black box of like, we don't know which drugs, we don't know how much, we don't know anything about the future.
Exactly.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the work that you do. I know this stuff is super complicated, and it's always nice when we have someone who can elucidate it a little bit. So thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. I really appreciated the opportunity. Thank you.
That concludes this episode of the Pharma Forum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about other installments in the series at pharmaforum.com/podcast. The Pharma Forum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podme, where you can find and subscribe by searching for Pharma Forum. And don't forget to visit our website, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and to follow us on Twitter at Pharma Forum. Thanks for listening.